Hi YouTube, it's Foxy here from Foxy Books and Planning. Since New Year's is just a few days away, I thought it would be a nice video to wrap up my reading journey for 2018 with my 5 favorite fiction books, my 5 least favorite fiction books, and then my favorite and least favorite nonfiction books. Alright, so to get started, I'm going to start with my worst books of the year. At number 5 for fiction is a book called The Wicked Deep by Eyre. I read this back in June as part of the Creating & Co. Book Club's Summer Readathon. I'll link Paige's channel and the Facebook group if you all want to join the book club down below. This was the group read for that readathon. The general story is we're following a girl named Penny Talbot during the summer in her small coastal town, but the town is haunted every summer by the ghosts of 3 girls who were drowned in the harbor during a Salem witch trials-esque event. And the way that the book explains everything is that once a year in June, these 3 drowned girls come back to the town, possess 3 of the young women in the town, and their goal is to kill a boy each by drowning. And in general, this book was not for me. I wouldn't have read it if it had not been for the readathon. It was one of those where I was really hoping it would be much more horror and fantasy than it actually was. It was much more like a contemporary YA book with fantasy and horror elements. And there wasn't a whole lot of world building. We're just dropped into this town. There's no explanation of why the town is haunted, how the curse works, if the curse can be broken. And there is some explanation, but there's not a lot, especially in how the curse came to be. It just kind of happens. Also, there is a twist at the end of this book that I saw coming, which did not help my enjoyment because I saw it coming from pretty much like the 3rd or 4th chapter. When the festival for the beginning of the June starts, I'm like, oh, okay, this is how this is going to go. And it just wasn't enjoyable for those reasons. I did enjoy sections of the book that focused on the town's paranoia surrounding the situation. There's a lot of segments where the town is fighting amongst themselves about trying to figure out which girls are possessed and how they're going to deal with the girls who are possessed and how to deal with preventing any more boys from dying. But anything other than that was just boring and slow and kind of pointless to me. Number 4 on my list is The Bells by Donnell and Clayton. This was another book I read for the Creating & Co. Readathon, but this was for the Christmas Bingo Readathon. The original Readathon was the first week of December, but Paige opened it up to anybody for the whole month if you wanted to go for Blackout, because that would be 25 books. And I was going towards Blackout. I'm only about halfway there, so I'm probably not going to make it. The Bells, I picked it up earlier this year because I thought it was a really interesting science fiction fantasy concept, because the concept is in this semi-dystopian world that may be a future of our world, maybe not. Everyone is born gray-skinned and red-eyed, and the Bells are a group of women who have the ability to change everyone else's appearances to make them beautiful. And we follow the girl Camilla, who is an up-and-coming belle whose main goal is to be the favorite of the royal family. I read this because it fulfilled the prompt of pretty cover, and it had been on my TBR since February. And I was really let down by this. There wasn't a whole lot of world building, in my opinion. There wasn't a whole lot of how did we get here? Why is this world the way it is? There wasn't even a lot of what some science fiction writers will do, where they drop you into the world and let you figure it out, but still give you the clues you need to figure it out. And Camilla wasn't really that likable of a character to me, because she's very concerned for a little bit about what's going on, what the motives of all the people around her are. But then the vast majority of the book is her taking beauty appointments and discussing beauty with other characters. And that just didn't really move the plot along. So after 400 pages with 40 pages left in the book, suddenly everything starts happening in a massive flurry of activity. And I'm one of those people, I would prefer to have the plot spread out across all the 440 pages rather than have stagnation for 400 pages and then rush everything at the end. Also, as a warning to those who were thinking about reading this, The Bells does contain a scene involving sexual assault. Personally, I did not feel that the sexual assault added anything to the book. I'm pretty sure you could have skipped it and it would not have affected the vast majority of people's reading experiences. So it was just one of those where I was doing did the author put this in for shock value? Was she trying to say something and didn't get a chance? But overall, I felt that whole situation was kind of unnecessary to the storytelling. Book 3 is one of 2 DNFs on my list. It is Mists of Avalon by Marion Zimmer Bradley. This is from a reading challenge I set for myself a couple of years ago to get through NPR's 100 Best Science Fiction and Fantasy Novels. I'll link that list down below in case y'all want to check it out. I'm about 2/3 of the way through it as of today. And the way this book was pitched to me when I started this 100 Best Science Fiction and Fantasy Books journey was that it was a feminist retelling of Arthurian legend where you get the story of King Arthur and his knights from the female character's perspective. So you would get King Arthur's story from Guinevere, Morgana, Morgause, and his mother, and so on and so forth. However, I felt that for all of the really good subplots, because there are some really interesting commentaries on religion and politics in the subplots, the main plots of Following the Women was a really big letdown for me. There wasn't a lot going on. There was a lot of women sitting in a room talking to each other about how much their lives sucked. And there was almost no effort made on the part of the women to either change their circumstances or handle the hands that they had been dealt. In general, they just kind of sat around and went, oh, woe is me, for pages on end, and that's not something I'm typically interested in reading. Number 2 on the worst books of the year list for me is the book Anathem by Neil Stephenson. This is the second book I have read by this author. I have also read the Cryptonomicon. And to complete my 100 science fiction and fantasy novels, I'm going to have to at least attempt Snow Crash. Neil Stephenson, as an author, I'm not really a great big fan of. I'm of the opinion that him and Stephen King and probably George R.R. Martin should have their word processors broken so they can only write on a typewriter or by hand, because then they would get to the point a whole lot faster. But Anathem is about this guy named Frau Erasmus, who is part of a monastic type cloister, who is at the beginning of the book getting ready to be inducted into one of the orders that lives at that particular cloister. And it's some kind of post-apocalyptic world, and there isn't a whole lot of explanation because you spend most of your time with Erasmus in the cloisters. I DNF'd it at about 40% just because there wasn't a whole lot happening. There was a couple of interesting passages where the cloister opens for the celebration of a decade being completed, and he's allowed out into the real world for the first time since he was brought into the monastery. And that was kind of interesting, but in general, it was just a lot of plotting. According to the Wikipedia page, there is aliens involved somehow in the book once the plot gets going, but I have no way of knowing because I stopped right as the alien plot got going and did not want to continue at that point. Mainly to do with the writing style. My worst book of the year, so my number 1 is not actually a book. It was an Audible original for the month of October. It's a short story called Lullaby by Jonathan Mayberry. It's not that very long. It's essentially a novella, maybe 3 or 4 hours of audiobook total. And the way Audible sold this was it was supposed to be like a spooky ghost story for Halloween. And the general idea is that family or husband and wife move into a house, paranormal phenomenon happen. And for me, there was very little suspense. There was very little plot. There's no effort made by the characters to do anything. It's just the paranormal stuff is happening. They don't try and figure out why it's happening. They don't try to stop the paranormal phenomenon. It just keeps happening. And at the end of the book, and it's like, and we go on with the paranormal phenomenon. And I'm just like, this is not a full story. This is like the start of a much longer book. And I feel like if Jonathan Mayberry had been given time to maybe flesh it out more, maybe another hour or two of audiobook, it would have been a lot better overall. But yeah, so moving on. My worst nonfiction book of the year is a book called The Defining Decade by Meg Jay. Meg Jay is a clinical psychologist who wrote this book to compile all of the anecdotes and stories she had from being a psychologist for people in their 20s and early 30s. And it's supposed to be kind of a self-helpy book where it shows what you need to do to make the most out of your 20s so that you have the work, money, family, and child situations you want when you're older. And for me, I read this as part of an alumni mentoring group for young through my alma mater that was done for young alumni. We were given this book and 5 for Your First 5, which was written by Allison McWilliams, who is the one of the directors of the Office of Personal and Career Development at my alma mater. And this one was just it was all anecdotal evidence. There was very little actual statistics or thought behind it. It was just, let me sit down and tell you the stories of the people I worked with and how we fixed their problems. And my biggest issues with this book were in the family and relationship sections of the book, because Meg is very heavily focused on the fact that in her worldview and the worldview that she has seen with her patients, the only way to be happy is to get married and have children in your 20s. And that if you are in a relationship, you should not live with that person before getting married, because that leads to divorce in her clients' experiences. And I don't really agree with that. And it was really hard for me to read it because she was so vehement about those stances. So now on to more happier fare. My 5th favorite book for the year in fiction is a book called Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. This is the 4th Neil Gaiman book I've read, also part of my 100 best science fiction and fantasy quest. So this book follows a guy named Richard Mayhew who saves a girl named Dor, and in doing so finds himself drawn into the world of London below. And he spends the book trying to get back to the world of London above and his fiancée, and he tries to do this by helping the girl Dor. And what I loved about this was very Neil Gaiman. It was very surreal. It was very sci-fi fantasy, but there was also enough grounding in reality that you could have thought that this had actually happened in London if you squinted hard enough. Also, the writing style was great. The pacing was great. And he does throw in some of his trademark humor throughout, so it's not just super serious the entire way through. My 4th favorite book for the year is a short story collection called I, Robot by Isaac Asimov, also part of the 100 best science fiction and fantasy novels quest. I really like this style of science fiction where it's a collection of short stories that has a framing narrative. One of my favorite books of all time is The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury, which is a similar collection of short stories that is linked together by a man's tattoos. And in this one, it's Asimov's robot short stories linked together using the reminiscence of a Dr. Kelvin, who is the chief robotic psychiatrist for the U.S. Robots and Mechanical Peoples Corporation. The book itself is made up of 9 of the short stories, and they cover the earliest robots being used in the population up until the machines taking over. And I really loved it. Every short story was impeccable, and it had Asimov's flair, and it was really great to see how all of the stories connected to one another and referenced one another throughout the book. Book 3, I actually have a physical copy of with me. It is The Eyre Affair by Jasper Fforde. And I'm not sure if you all can read this, but the Wall Street Journal explains it as a combination of elements from Monty Python, Harry Potter, Stephen Hawking, and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. This was a gem that I discovered doing the 100 Best Science Fiction and Fantasy Novels. It's part of the Thursday Next series. This is the first book. And a general idea is that this is kind of speculative in that it starts with the United Kingdom and Russia never ending the Crimean War. They've been fighting it for over 100 years, and how that affects society. So the book itself is set in 1985, but England is a totalitarian state. Wales is an independent communist nation. And you have Thursday, who is a literary detective with the Special Operations Department of Literature. And her job is basically to prevent what is the word I'm looking for? She's out looking for stolen manuscripts, altered manuscripts, because in this world, literature means more to people than anything else. There's a huge subplot about who really wrote Shakespeare's plays, and the overall plot is that Thursday gets pulled onto a special task force to hunt one of her college professors who has gone rogue and is changing fiction by entering through a weapon the original manuscripts and removing characters. And it gets its title from the main book that he affects as he goes into the original manuscript for Jane Eyre and removes Jane from the manuscript. And so Thursday is running all over the country trying to find Jane, get her back in the manuscript, and fix all the changes that were made by Jane being removed. I really loved it. To me, it reads much more like Terry Pratchett did speculative science fiction. But I really, really enjoyed it. I really want to continue the series. It'll probably be a while till I do, but I'm really looking forward to it. Book number 2 is a cheat, as is my number 1 pick, because they're both series, because I read multiple books in these series this year. Number 2 is the Stormlight Archives by Brandon Sanderson. I read The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance this year. Brandon Sanderson is slowly becoming one of my favorite, if not my favorite, epic fantasy writer of all time. The way he interweaves his narratives and structures his narratives differently through all of his different series, and the way he does character and magic systems is impeccable. I really enjoyed the fact that he came up with a completely different world than I've ever seen in any kind of science fiction or fantasy novel for these books. And I appreciate immensely the magic system, which is similar to Mistborn, but not exactly the same. And I like the fact that he managed to make a vast group of characters that are really, really enjoyable. And I'm currently working on Oathbringer. I just need to get it back from the library so I can finish it. And my number 1 best fiction books for the year are the Vorkosigan Saga by Louis McMaster Bujold. I read 2 of the books this year. I read Barayar, which is the 7th book in publication order and the 3rd book in the chronological order for the series, and The Warrior's Apprentice, which is publication order book 2 and chronological order book 4. I say that because it's a book of almost 16 or 17 novels, not including short stories. And there's 2 different timelines that you can read them on. Goodreads defaults to publication order, and then there's also a chronological order, so you can see the events take place in the appropriate order. So these are these 3rd and 4th books I've read. I've been reading them in chronological order. Barayar focuses on Cordelia Naismith, who is the heroine of the first novel in the series, The Shards of Honor. I highly recommend you check it out if you haven't. It's a great place to start for an epic science fiction saga, because it does span multiple books, multiple timelines, multiple characters. If you don't like reading about a character, you can switch to sub-sagas within where they focus on different characters. And then The Warrior's Apprentice focuses on Cordelia's son, Miles Vorkosigan, who has failed his entrance exams into the Barrayarn Military Academy and goes on vacation, and shenanigans ensues. Definitely one of my favorites. It's amazing because my parents recommended I read it as a teenager and I never got around to it, and I'm reading it now and I'm like, holy crap, why didn't I read this earlier? This has to be one of my favorite series of all time. All right, and my final book I want to talk about is my favorite nonfiction book for the year. It's a book called Get Well Soon, History's Worst Plagues and the Heroes Who Fought Them by Jennifer Wright. Now, the way this book is structured is every chapter focuses on a different disease. And Jennifer Wright does a really amazing job of going in each chapter and explaining what the disease was, what the symptoms were, how it was spread, and then how we either cured it or treated it. And on top of that, each chapter focuses on almost a sociological portion of the disease. So going back and looking at how society treated people with the disease, how the society dealt with the disease. And the diseases span everything from the Antonine Plague of ancient Rome all the way up to polio in the 1950s. My personal favorite chapter is the chapter about tuberculosis, which focuses on the 19th century. And each chapter, before she tells you what disease, she has a witty title with humor, because humor is interspersed throughout the entire book. And her tuberculosis chapter focuses not on the disease itself, but on how the disease was portrayed in 19th century popular culture and how it became in vogue and a fad to look like you had tuberculosis, to the point where women were purposefully infecting themselves so that they could have the tuberculosis look of very pale, very thin, very sickly. I loved the way that she, as I stated earlier, that she interweaves the humor with the fact, with the sociology, with the science. She doesn't go too hard science if you're worried about it being too chemistry, biology heavy. It's very high level and really approachable for everybody. And with that being said, that rounds out my favorite books of the year. Favorite and worst books of the year. I hope you all enjoyed. Please like and subscribe. Comment down below if you agree or disagree with my picks. And I hope to catch you next week in my 2019 goals video. Hope to see you then. Bye.